Hey, welcome to On Hand Art. So, a few years ago, I learned to my great sorrow that these sleds were not built for a 200 plus pound man and their 6 year old. So, we're going to use this as a canvas today. So, let's get started. This object does invoke strong images of winter, but I want to look past that and go more for the round shape, a sense of play, and joy. To do that, I'm combining the romance of the moon with the comfort of houses. To start the prep stage for this piece, I'm gessoing the areas I'll paint later, along with areas that I'll be gluing to. For the moon, I'm building that up with 80-pound archival cardstock. This is a mix of two different yellows, and that will give me a foundation of a patchwork look. I'm using Mod Podge to glue them together to make sure that not only do I have a lasting bond, but it gives it a little bit more stiffness. Now, whenever possible, I like to use the existing objects as the templates. So I'll be using the sled as a template as I cut out the basic outside shape. The reason I left a gap that you see there is because this will eventually be a moon shape. So I'm trying to reduce the amount of waste I have, but at this point, I'm actually not sure what the final shape will look like. Once I got it all cut out, I found out that this large sheet was actually way too floppy. So I'm coming back with a second layer of archival cardstock. Now this time I'm using purple, but only because it's the least used color in the house. But once that was ready and dry, I can lay it back on the sled and mark out a rough moon shape. I'll leave somewhat of a flat platform area. Later you'll see what I use that for. In the meantime, I'll speed through cutting it out, but this is actually where I'll adjust the final shape as I cut. I'll be using that center paper later, but with the moon cut out, I can glue it on the sled. I'm using contact cement because not much is actually going to stick to the plastic. Now I did, as I'd mentioned before, prime the entire ridge of the sled with gesso, and that's just to make sure that this glue will stick a little bit better. And I'm recording this about 3 weeks after I finished the piece, and it's still holding nice and strong, so I'm going to say it worked. To make the guts of the moon, I'll be using these chunks of old wall paint. I've collected these over the years by letting leftover paint dry in the can, then breaking it out. It also helps when the paint freezes over the winter because it becomes more like chunks instead of like the discs I've used in other pieces. This part took a couple of hours just trying to figure out what pieces fit where. For the anchor pieces, I started with the largest pieces that would actually just fit this space. I call these anchor pieces because all the other chunks will attach to them and to the sled. I also wanted to end up with a somewhat even surface while still looking like chunks of rocks. So I'm looking for relatively large chunks with smoothish faces. Now I don't know if smoothish is a word, but it is now. Anyway, I'll start by cementing them to the paper and the sled with contact cement. With these large rocks in place, I'm gluing them to each other with hot glue. This is also where I can start filling in some of these gaps with hot glue. But with the bottom half done and secure, I can start on the top half. My hope here was that with the bottom secure, it would better support the top, and that seems to have worked out. Also, with most of this in place, I was able to cement and hot glue the new pieces at the same time, making this go a little bit faster. I did let this rest overnight to make sure that the contact cement was fully cured, and then I came back and filled in the rest of these gaps with smaller sheets and chunks of the paint. And even though it was still kind of hunting for the right size and shape of pieces, or even cutting them to fit while trying to make them look like rocks, this part went much faster because I could just hot glue it all together. Moving on to the background, I'm starting with my favorite brush. This is a nice, flat, and manageably sized brush that will let me get into all the nooks and crannies under the moon rocks. Once I get that all painted in, I'm using the same brush to add a thick base coat of my sky blue. Now, my original goal here was to start blending away that circle pattern in the plastic of the sled, but those ridges are too deep and defined to make disappear without having first sanded them down or maybe used a fill-in media or something. So I tried adding a thicker, more textured layer. But not only can you still see those ridges, it would only get worse when the paint dried, and I didn't like the look. So I decided to stop trying to fight the nature of the sled and go with the flow. And I actually like the energy and look of this much, much better. For the moon, I initially wanted a kind of paneled look. So before I start painting, I'm sectioning off where the paper is already divided. Now at this point in the process, I wanted to highlight the divisions, so I'm filling those areas with the lighter of 2 yellows. On camera, it might not actually look like a big difference, but it adds a lot of texture and less of an even color than the paper naturally has. I came back with a darker yellow for the rest of the moon, but after living with it for a while, I didn't really like the look for this piece. So while the first coat was still pretty wet, I'm coming back over the whole piece with the same darker yellow. And then I blended that all together, which I'll show you that a little bit later. With the blue sky area now dry, I'm going to fluff in some clouds. I'm starting with my favorite brush again, dropping in large amounts of this light gray. I then switch to what I'm calling a blending brush. This is an old makeup brush my wife gave me, so I'm not sure what it started out life as, but it's a blending brush now. Either way, it allows me to swirl in large amounts of this cloud white while leaving a lot of texture. And then I'll come back later and clean up some of those edges. I wanted them to feel playful while not being too childlike, so there's a bit of a balance there. And then at the same time, I felt like they were too dark and lacked contrast and definition. So to fix that, I'm coming back over them with a little bit of titanium white. With the clouds drying, it's time to paint, well, the paint. Now, I want this part of the piece to fade into the background, so I'm using a medium gray to cover everything, especially the hot glue that I used to fill the holes and gaps. And because the hot glue areas are very smooth, I'm adding texture just to blend it back into the surrounding areas. As impatient as I can be, I'm being careful to paint the upper edges of all those rocks without bleeding onto the yellow face of the moon. For me, art is about immersing the viewer in a story, and there are certain mistakes in craft that can break them out of that story. Even small marks of overpaint in the wrong place can do it. So just like I'm doing here, I'll normally do a first pass, then I'll come back hours or even days later with a fresh look to do the final pass. But with this drying, let's move on to the final elements. I'm using the offcuts from earlier to add some houses. I'll cut them into some small strips and then assemble them into one long strip. Since all the sides are kind of wonky, I'll start by truing up one end using the lines on my cutting mat. For a quick and easy way to get a right angle, I'm grabbing this sheet of cardstock, matching it against the edge I just cut. Marking 3 points like I'm doing here ensures that I have a straight line where I can match up my straight edge. Then all I have to do is measure these 3 points across and cut the third side. To make the house, I'm starting by marking the folds, starting with a long side, alternating long, short, and then adding a rough tab on the end. I'm folding against my straight edge. Okay, well, not my straight edge, but this ruler here. And you're welcome for the dad joke. A pro tip here, it's easier and you'll get a cleaner fold if you fold the house up towards the tab rather than trying to fold that little tab up. And then I'm gluing the tab with Mod Podge, and since it's so thick, I'll hold it with blue tape until it's dry. Originally, I was going to cut the roof peaks into the box, but I want them to overhang a little. So I'll cut off the top area and use the rest of my scrap to make those peaks. Measuring against the house body itself, I'm measuring for the first of the 3 roof peaks. I'm only making the front peak for all 3 houses. Not only will there be no way for you to see the back of these houses, it's actually too hard to get these peaks to line up, meaning the roofs could end up twisted, and not in a fun way. But once I have that first triangle measured and cut, all I have to do is trace it out a couple more times and then cut those out. With my peaks attached, I'm using a single sheet of cardstock for the roofs. I'll measure against the house and then I'll cut those to size. And because I didn't think ahead and include tabs while I was cutting them out, I'm gluing the roofs on with these separate little tabs. To finish them up, I'm painting them white, using the paint to fill in any gaps between the house, roof, and roof peak. When they're dry, it's time to paint on the doors and windows. To keep them all uniform, I made little templates for the door and windows. Now all I have to do is trace out the doors and windows before painting them on. I'm using Mars Black in a small brush, being careful to cover that pencil line. I'll speed you through this part because I'm sure you get the idea. Really, the hardest part for me here is just keeping that outside edge of my line straight. It's not my strong suit. I'm really kind of more of a go with the flow, abstract paint, because it's messy kind of guy. And it's kind of funny because I was thinking about how these little black and white houses have become kind of a theme in my work lately. I think I just like their simplicity. For me, it represents an uncomplicated, safe place, free from the world's BS. Once they're fully dry, I can mark off and cut around the surface texture and cut around the back just to compensate for the curve of the sled. I'll use hot glue to attach them initially, and then I'll fill in any gaps later. And then the final step is just to paint and blend in the hot glue with the rest of the surface. But with that done, I'll show you the finished piece in a minute. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video because I had a lot of fun with this piece. It's weird, silly, well, fun, and I just enjoy looking at it. And I think when you get to the point where you can just enjoy your own work, that's really, as an artist, when you win. Now, I also hope you learn to think in terms of yes and, so taking ideas that wouldn't logically or normally go together, mashing them up and seeing what happens. That's really where a lot of growth and great ideas come from. But if nothing else, maybe hit that like button and subscribe, maybe tell a couple of friends, but also leave a comment and let us all know what you're thinking. But without further ado, here's the finished piece.